So in 1922, my grandfather, Eladio Cocelli, he left Colonia. It's a tiny town in Calabria, and he came to Detroit. He got a job in Ford Motors foundries, big blast furnaces. In Italy, he'd been a shepherd. He worked in the sun. Stepping into the foundry had to seem like going to hell each day. The men he worked with were all other immigrants. No one born here would possibly take that job. It took him 6 years working there to save enough to send for my grandmother Katerina and their now 7-year-old son. Oh, God. Your microphone's open. Yeah, it took him 6 years of working there to save enough to send for my grandmother Katerina and their now 7-year-old son, my uncle Nicola. They had 4 more kids. The youngest, Nunziata, that was my mom. And the kids grew up seriously Italian. Italian was their first language, but they each married Americans. So my generation, none of us speak the language. None of us know much about being Italian. None of us know anything about being Calabrese. We were born typical Midwesterners, and that's the way we all were. The grandparents never went back to Italy. Their kids have never been to Italy. And when my grandparents died, we lost all contact with our extended family. But I was always curious. And a couple of years ago on Facebook, I met one of the I knew my grandmother had 2 sisters, and one had moved to Australia with her family, and the other had moved to Milan in the north with her family. A couple of years ago on Facebook, I met one of the Australian cousins, and he told me every summer, the Australians and the Northern Italians, they all returned to Colonia, to the tiny town. He told me when they moved, they couldn't sell the house. I mean, Calabria is the poorest part of Italy. No one would buy a home there. Everyone wants to leave there. So they still have the home they left, and he told me I could stay there if I'd like. They stay for the whole month of August. Italians know how to vacation. A couple years ago, I went there for a week. I'm a Midwesterner. I'm not Italian. I was there for a week, but it was magical. The town is ancient. The roads were built by the Romans 2,000 years ago. It sits high on a mountain. It's 3 miles from the sea. Fresh seafood pretty much every meal. Every day is exactly the same. You wake up, you go down to the main square. There's a cafe. You have your coffee. Everyone goes to the beach. After lunch, everyone naps. After dinner, everyone goes back to the main square. The cafe is now a bar. You drink wine and talk shit all night. Every day, exactly the same. And every second of every day, everyone's there. Because no one's got a job. And that's why my grandparents left. It's dirt poor. But I loved it. It was just so comfortable and just like nothing to worry about at all. There was one thing that bothered me. I'm as closely related to the Australians and the Northern Italians as they are to each other. But they had grown up getting together every summer. They went to each other's weddings. They're family. I was a novelty. I'm not going to get invited back to the weddings. And I was kind of jealous, and I kind of blamed my grandparents a little bit, because if they had gone back to Italy and taken their kids, maybe my mom would have taken me and I could have been part of all of that. But the overwhelming thing I came away with about my grandparents, having been there and walked the streets they left, was just a sense of awe. One day, my cousins found the address of their old home, and we went to see it. It's a tiny place in a wall of other tiny homes, and it's been vandalized and destroyed by squatters a long time ago, but the porch was intact. And I stood on the porch, and I looked down at the sea, and the sea they looked at when they left, and having walked those streets and knowing how comfortable the life there was, I knew some things with certainty. One, if I had been born there, I would have died there. There's no way I would have had the courage to leave. And two, for them to have crossed that ocean to a land where they didn't know anybody and they didn't speak the language, they had to be so driven to get here and bust their asses to make a better life for themselves and their kids and their grandkids. And it strikes me that that work ethic and drive was something America really needed back then. And frankly, we could use more of it now. And I think also those are probably far more accurate stereotypes of most immigrants wanting to come here than a lot of the hate that's been thrown around lately. Off my soapbox, sorry. Not that long ago, I was at the Tenement Museum, just over here. It's an apartment building that had housed wave after wave of immigrants, and they've redone several of the apartments as they might have looked. And the tour took us to one that had housed an Italian family. Guide tells us man had come from Sicily in 1922. In 1928, he had saved enough to send for his wife, but there was a problem. In 1924, Congress had passed a law limiting immigrants from Italy to 3,000 a year. It had previously been hundreds of thousands. They didn't limit the whiter Northern Europeans, the Germans, the British, but the Italians, see, we're swarthy, and we're dirty people, we're prone to crime, and we're lazy, and if one of us did get a job, we'd be taking it from another American. And all of that is in the congressional record. It's the actual reason. I mean, it's said more politely, but, and she said, this couple, they were poor, and there was no way this woman was going to get one of 3,000 spots. She got in the country somehow, but she was without papers, which is where the nice word WAP comes from. Because she was without papers, she could never go back to Italy. She couldn't risk being able to get back in the country, and it was one of the heartbreaks of her life. I think everyone else on the tour was probably looking at their phone, trying to figure out where they're going to go for lunch. I felt like I got hit in the head with a shovel, because I had never heard of that law, and my grandmother came here in 1928, and they were dirt poor. I have to assume my grandmother and my uncle were here without papers, and that explains why they never went back to Italy. Fear of the different in the 1920s reaches forward to today to mess up my relationship with my extended family. And that's nothing compared to the fear a lot of immigrants face today, I know that. But it's harm, and it's real, and it flows directly from this kind of a law, and you can never fix it. And that law, by the way, was on the books until the mid-1960s. This typical Midwest American, I was born into an America that had that law on its books, which is kind of crazy. But anyway, when I see a hater now, someone hating on immigrants, I always ask them, do you have any Italian in you? Because if you're new to the country, you're not going to hate on immigrants. And if you've been here a few generations, your family's been here a few generations, you probably got some Italian in you. Because let's face it, we're the sexiest people there are. And then I tell them about that law. And I tell them I'm the proud half-Calabrese grandson of Caterina Cricelli, a woman the hater would probably call an illegal. And I tell them about my uncle. Even though he was not yet a citizen, he joined the army. He hit Omaha Beach at D-Day, fought his way across France, and came back with a fistful of medals. And that's the 7-year-old boy America didn't want. We should not be repeating this kind of bullshit. Thank you.